So the main thrust behind this idea was we heard Bob was coming into town, and this is Bob Sandford, everybody. And we wanted to have more of a discussion on equal terms. So we thought roundtable discussion. That's where we come, we sit down, we share stories, we talk about very, very broadly, and we're going to have sort of a self-directed discussion, maybe on the sort of the State of the Union type thing, communication with policymakers and media, and then maybe sort of what's the vision for Canada's freshwater policy, whether water, ice, snow, but then also how those changes will impact the ecology in our country. So that's why Bob's here to talk to us about that, but we also brought in some great academic leaders in Canada as well. I have the pleasure of having Heidi as a supervisor. I've asked her to come because I thought she'd be a good complement. So we're dealing with a lot of water specialists, but she's has expertise in food web structure and ecology and the impacts of climate change on northern populations of fish. And their food webs. So that would be a nice complement discussion. We also have, and Jessica's going to introduce the other two.
Hi. So we have Alex Bielak here. He is the scientific liaison extraordinaire. So he's I guess the go-between policy and science. We're trying to translate science into more, I guess, edible, understandable terms for the greater masses. We also have Nandita Basu. She's a really neat cross between civil engineering and environment. And she's been teaching sustainability in the United States for quite a few years as well.
So now, before Bob gets into his presentation, I was hoping we would just quickly go around, name what your degree is, and a quick summary of what you're working on, what you're researching, just so we all get to know what we do, where we're coming from. So we'll start with Bob.
Well, I'll explain what I do in the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
Great.
Hi, Jessica introduced me well. So I'm new here, relatively. I started here in 2013 as a cross between earth sciences and environmental engineering. Before that, I was in the US. I was also on faculty there. And my interest is, so I'm a hydrologic modeler, watershed modeler by training, and my interest is in the sustainable management of water resources kind of questions. So while I was in the US, I used to teach sustainability and water, kind of similar to the Water 601 class that you're taking. And then right now I teach a class, Engineering for Sustainable Development, to second year civil engineering students. So I'm interested a lot in these, some of the things that Bob was talking about communication, because I think that's where one of the biggest gaps exist in how we communicate what's happening.
I'm Brienne. I'm a PhD candidate in the biology department, and I'm looking at hydroelectric dams and how they impact fish in terms of growth and pollution.
And I'm Ashley Sasso. I'm also a PhD student, a PhD candidate. Also have the pleasure of Heidi being my supervisor. And I'm looking at Arctic marine ecosystems, food web structure, as part of an environmental assessment with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Just understanding how environmental gradients affect food web structure in an area that is not very well described.
My name is Taryn. I'm a PhD candidate as well. I'm a little different in that I work for an immunologist and I work in Arctic fish. And so I'm interested in pathogen-mediated selection. So I'm looking at how pathogens in the environment drive populations.
I'm Heather Dixon. I'm a student in Mike Powell's lab in biology, and I study Atlantic salmon marine feeding in the Northwest Atlantic, an area in which we're pretty data deficient. And I'm studying that using a combination of gut contents analysis and stabilized stored analysis.
I'm Rachel DeYoung, and I'm a master's student with Heidi Swanson as well in biology. And I'm looking at the influence of fish movement on their mercury concentration in the far north of Ontario.
I'm completely different.
My name is Marie-Claire Brisbois, and I'm finishing up my PhD in environment, and I'm working on collaborative approaches to water governance and natural resource industry involvement in the Athabasca and in southwestern Ontario.
My name is Lauren. I'm just finishing doing my master's in sustainability management, and my research is on community-based social marketing and how to get people to reduce their water consumption and increase their perception of risks, specifically floods.
My name is Laura. I'm a PhD candidate in the biology department, and my research is looking at UV stress effects in phytoplankton and rapid automated measurement techniques, specifically looking at a spectrophotometer.
And Laura, thank you. You don't need to show us the concept of island biogeography.
I know. I didn't want to get in the way of the cameras when I had to leave later.
Join us.
I knew I had to leave early.
Okay. My name's Gertje. I'm from the Netherlands, and I did my PhD in soil science in Germany. And I came here in February to do a postdoc, and mainly here I will be looking at biogeochemical processes in soil and mainly the effect of water table fluctuation on carbon cycling in soil.
I am Jessica. I kill little shrimpy things, not for fun, but for science. And so the problem with the shrimps is that there are actually 85 different species that all look the same. We thought they were just one species. And the only way you could tell them apart is by looking at their DNA. So I rip off their legs and mash them up and look at their DNA after that. Then I raise their baby as my own, and I slowly kill them with copper and nickel. To see how different, how each species, even though they look the same, to see how different they respond. And so that was my master's. For my PhD, plan on throwing in some black magic stable isotopes to figure out what they actually eat in the wild. So it's going to be fun stuff.
Do you keep any as a pet?
I was thinking about it, but I don't think John will, my supervisors would approve.
Hello, I'm Kyle Ardo. I study the life history of Arctic grayling on the tundra in the Northwest Territories. The reason I study that is because we're looking at creating a monitoring program for a diamond mine going into development that's going to substantially change the flow downstream of the headwater lake they're draining. So we want to learn as much as we can about how Arctic grayling use the habitat, not only to try and preserve their habitat, but they're also a good indicator of stream health in the region.
I'm Heidi Swanson, from biology. I work in Arctic aquatic ecology and contaminant accumulation, multiple stakeholders, diamond mines. A lot of my work is now driven by First Nations questions, people wanting to understand why their traditional food sources are contaminated with different pollutants and how that might respond to climate change. And I have a fabulous group of students.
And I'm Alex Bielak, and just to prove how ancient I am, I'm studying, I used to study salmon with the parent of your supervisor.
Oh, Jeff!
So Jeff was my supervisor, graduated from here in '84, and I'm the antithesis of an academic. I'm a complete gadfly, so I'm all about intersections and connections. So I worked at UNU, where Bob now holds a chair. I'm lectured to this fine group of students at CWN. I'm involved with the Canadian Rivers Institute, but I also write about food. I'm now retired, which means I'm busier than ever.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing. And Bob, I think we're ready for a quick presentation.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. And this is a room filled with quite amazing people. And I always find it really wonderful when you're around people who like fish. And I'm kind of into that myself. So very interested in the research they saw. I went to the Cold Regions lab yesterday and was very impressed with what they were doing there too. And also, I'm really privileged to have such high-powered academic staff here too. And to see Alex again is a great pleasure.
Anybody? Well, it's absolutely open. So.
Okay, I've got some observations. We need to look at where things are published. There's a lot of effort that goes into trying to promote things via various media channels, but who knows, for example, that the Toronto Star is the biggest newspaper in Canada. It has a huge number of eyeballs on it every day, whereas some other papers, National Post, for example, have far more restricted circulation. So you need to consider the media that are being targeted and who's doing the spokespersonship. The second point is that's addressing the public. John Miller, a very interesting academic who's done a lot of studies on demographics and has categorized the number of policymakers in the United States as 8,200. Those are the people who make policy for science. And that's an interesting number. Those are people who, the number of actual decision makers on policy and science is about 200, I think, but I'm doing that off the top of my head, so don't hold me to that. But 8,000 people also provide input, so they're thought leaders, university presidents, and so on, people who have research staffs, and so on. When you're looking at the public, John had said that you need to look at the strata of the public. So you have an engaged public, and if you're trying to reach them, okay, they're already engaged, and they're already going to write their congressman, no matter what you do. So that's easy. You're preaching to converted. You have a proportion, probably between 20 to 40% at the high end, who are interested, and they'll watch Discovery Channel. But then you've got those who simply aren't interested, and then certainly a proportion of people who are completely will act actively against any message that you want to give. So given that, you can expend a lot of energy trying to get to the public, and it's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference. So the people to target are probably those 8,200 policymakers, far smaller number in Canada. And how do you do that? That's the crux of a lot of the work that I've been involved with in the past, and certainly Bob as well. And the skills to interface between, say, science and policy are absolutely critical. There's, I think, a moral duty for people who are doing the kind of studies that you've done, we've done in the past, to speak out about such issues. But you've got to have a skill set. So Sir Thomas King, the chief scientist for the UK government, talked about the need for communication skills in science and for scientists and developing those. And a recent article, I think maybe a year or so ago in Science Korea, has talked about the rise of knowledge brokering as a profession. So those of you who eventually are not going to be pure researchers and academics, like myself, I knew that I was going to be a hopeless scientist at the time I was doing my PhD. I never understood statistics or anything, so I devoted myself to other stuff. That acting as intermediaries between two communities is actually a valid profession, and there are skill sets that go along with that, and those people can make a lot of difference. So when I was at UNU, I developed the K-STAR concept that talked about the range of communications techniques and so on. So those are just some observations from me. First time I've heard the term atmospheric rivers, which tells you obviously how out of touch I am. Very interesting talk. Thanks.
Okay.
Do you mind if I step in? I'm just, I have to respectfully disagree with you on how to communicate and affect policy. And that's just because I'm coming from my generation. It's my opinion from maybe we should, the social license of talking to just policymakers is a very, very effective way to create change. But I get the sense now that the public no longer has a lot of faith in a lot of the established channels of change. So I think that maybe trying to appeal to the public isn't the worst idea anymore, just because it's a lot easier.
No, don't get me wrong, we're in violent agreement. I'm not suggesting you should do one over the other.
Yeah.
What I will say, though, is traditionally we have concentrated only on the public. So when you look at government departments, they have communications department. What do those communications department do? They keep the minister out of trouble. They spread the message of the given government, and they're not interested in making the link, the bridge between science and policy. Same for industry. They have public relations departments. What are they there for? What does the university communications department do? It says, look at us, we're doing this great research. In essence, the subjacent messages give us money. And there's been very little focus on the other. So I'm advocating a rebalancing of big C corporate communications to little c communication. So absolutely, you've got to do them both. I'm not saying one or the other, but the fact is the people who are making the policy still make the policy based on the information they get. And you want to make sure that they get the information when they want it and in the format they want it.
I'll just make a couple of observations on what you said. I'm particularly interested in what you're talking about in terms of knowledge brokering. And I've been talking to Kyle and Jessica about this. It seems to me that we almost need a new discipline to build that scientific gap or fill that gap. It requires a very specific solid grounding in science, but it also is very interested in the public policy aspects here. It really requires to know how governments work and how they absorb information. And I think this is really important because what you were saying is, I see declining government capacity, partly because of budget cuts and also because of a demographic shift here that's opening a huge gap, which undoubtedly some of you will fill. But also what you're talking about, Alex, is a shift away from technical elements toward communication. And the communication is outward, not inward. And this is a highly problematic scenario because again, it requires a really skilled intervention to be able to bridge that gap at this time. But what I am also seeing, and I work in advising a number of provincial government, not the federal government, they're not interested in hearing from anyone, but provincially, they are hungry for personal relations that over a period of time can supply them with the information and knowledge on a reliable, trustworthy basis. And that means dealing with governance, not politics. That means that you're not working on the front page of the newspaper. You're actually using long-term developed relationships with deputy ministers or even ministers that they come to rely on you to find that scientific information, to link them with the scientists that they need to do that. And again, I think a really good example is one I brought up yesterday, and I also mentioned this to Kyle and Jessica. The signing recently of the Northwest Territories Province of Alberta Agreement on the Mackenzie River. It shows that you can still have that science informing policy. But I'm with you, it's getting harder and harder, and that's why I really think that we need to rethink that knowledge brokering function. It's more critical than ever.
I think, so, I mean, I work a lot in sort of who's telling government what, but I also teach, and I've also been in an engineering department, and I'm now working in policy. So I've been working sort of at the interface for a long time, but I don't think, I mean, it would be nice to have a separate department for people studying it, but I also think that, I mean, every single student should be required to take a class in how to talk, because the amount of translation I do is incredible, and it goes both ways from discussing with engineers how important context and people are, and on the governance side, talking about, well, that numbers aren't scary and that you can have these conversations. But it's also something, so we talk about it a lot in terms of natural science and people being able to communicate the science, but the same thing comes up in social science as well. And I'm in environment and resource studies, and we're having these conversations because ERS used to be a very activisty sort of 60s hub of radicals and people having conversations and sitting on the floor to have class. And that's gone away. But I have students who I teach about all the terrible things or troubling things with water governance who come to the end of classes and are extremely discouraged because they have all this knowledge now and they don't know how to fix things. And I think this is, it's generational, like it's the range of students coming up, people who have grown up only being politically aware with the Harper government in power. So this is what they know, and they don't know that it's ever been different. And so even on a social science stream, I think we need to be having a class in how to talk to people. And you can call that activism, but it's advocacy. It's all these things, from being able to have conversations with people in your community to being able to have conversations with people you view as people in roles of authority or decision makers, all the way up the spectrum to, like, if you need to get out in the streets and have a march and have respectful conversations that way, all the way up, but that whole spectrum of having conversations on different levels. And I think that's something that needs to change, not necessarily in a specific department, but across all of academia.
Could I just make a comment on what you just said? First of all, what you said in your opening remarks about being careful with this. I'm not saying that this should become an academic discipline, because the moment a discipline starts talking to itself, you're in trouble, right? And in fact, this is really kind of something that will help disciplines get their best research forward. So I also, your concept of growing up knowing only the Harper government, that kind of sent a chill down my spine. But the fact of the matter is that there are still places, and really good places, to work in government in Canada. I just remember, and we also talk about this generational thing, I think there's a real opportunity coming up because of this demographic shift. And the only other time that I've ever seen this in my life was when I was about 20. And what happened is the post-war generation all retired, and it left this huge gap. And also, this is when environmental logic was coming in, and whole new shifts were occurring in a whole range of things. And it was a time of enormous opportunity. And what was different about it, too, is that at that time, public service was considered to be a noble calling. That you would work for government and for the good of your society was something you could be really proud of. I don't think that's the case now. We've really contaminated that. So, but I still look at, there's cells inside some of the provincial governments where there's young people there that are really energetic, they're good managers, and there's avenues up while you're young. And I still, at finding those are the ones that could be most helpful. Because, and the other thing I want to say about that, if I may, and Alex might have some comments on this one, I'm sure he will, but the point I want to make is that we've got to try and find ways to shave 10 years off the length of time it takes for bright, skilled young people to get into senior decision-making, policy-making positions. Because you get there when you're 55, you're at the end of your career, maybe you've had most of the edges knocked off or burnt off, and it would be nice if we could get people with strong vision and sensibilities into those positions earlier. And I'm not sure how to do that, but I see an opportunity in this shift.
Yeah. I think that you're dead on, and there are ways to do it. I see now CWN is raising cohorts of students who have something in common by having participated in various retreats and are forming the interconnections which I think will serve them later in life. The same is true for Canadian Rivers Institute. Again, they have a large nexus of students who will have gone through the system, overlapping and going to retreats and so on. It certainly didn't happen in my day at university. You did your research, you were in your lab, and you went out for beers. That was about it. But there was nothing organized that cohesively took people out on a field course. So CWN has in the past done these river days or river weeks where they bring a set of students, say, to the Grand River, and they go out the whole drainage basin for a week, learning about all the impacts, talking to decision makers and so on. It's a shared bonding experience which I think is quite valuable. It also happens within the UN system on various issues. I'm not certain whether it happens on water, but that's perhaps an opportunity. So that's a powerful idea, and one that could be encouraged or formalized.
Can I ask you a question on this? What are you seeing in terms of openness of government departments to collaborate with you institutionally on an ongoing basis? Because what I'm seeing, I want you to tell me what you're seeing. What I'm seeing is that because this thing's closing up and there's almost a distrust of government that you were bringing up, people in those jobs in those places feel somewhat besieged. And I think that what I've seen is they're looking for outside collaboration they can trust. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context. I think there are a lot of people in government who are working below the political level, so sort of policy advisors, people in those roles, who are trying really hard to collaborate and listen to people. They're soliciting information and trying to pass it up, but that depending on the issue that they're trying to pass up information on, it's often getting knocked down. And yeah, I think that there's the best of intentions in a lot of people, but what you're talking about getting those people who are sort of more open in those higher positions is I mean, that's what I study as well, and in terms of who actually gets the ear and how do those decisions get made. And I have examples of, in the Athabasca, people putting together their state of the watershed reports and having, this is what the science is saying, this is what we think should happen, sending that up, and then just
having it shelled.
Exactly, because there's another level of interest that you can't get through. So, but it depends on the issue as well, because if there's something where there isn't that hard economic or political driver saying this is the way it needs to be, I think governments are very willing to listen. It's just where the balance of power lies.
I think I wanted to add 2 points to what you've been saying. One is a bit of an anecdote, and I think some of the lower to mid-level civil servants are coming up with very creative ways to be able to communicate. So for example, the changes to the Fisheries Act, which affect resource developments in the north and elsewhere, and our research there. There was a presentation even in Yellowknife last year where they desperately wanted to communicate to us how no-net loss habitat compensation was going to change, and this whole investment offset thing was going to change, but their deck wasn't approved. So they stood up at the front of the room, and there was only about 20 of us, and we all knew each other personally, so people knew that they weren't going to be outed. And they said, ask us this question, and they would like hold up a sign, no deck. They're like, if you ask us this question directly, we can answer it, but we can't volunteer the information. So that I thought was like very telling as to how they're being so managed in the communication strategy. But the other point I wanted to mention about...
That's interesting. Why that?
Yeah, it's really something else. About harnessing the energy of youth. So when, May-ish 2012, when all the cuts came to Pearl and ELA and atmospheric monitoring, the following year, or just last year, I was invited to give a talk on advocacy of science to the Canadian Council of Deans of Science. And it was really disappointing to me because I could tell they were really enthused about this the year previous, when all these cuts had happened and everyone was galvanized and there was the Death of Evidence March and there was a lot of energy. And then a year later, the NSERC guy was in the room and he was like, oh, we're throwing you a few more carrots. Like, look, we increased this funding envelope. And they're all like, okay. But I think mostly they're tired, right? Like they're super worn down, have incredibly difficult jobs, and they just need help, like keeping that energy and momentum going. And so I see a real role for young researchers and communicators to keep that spark going.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to bash governments these days, and they need that support. Those people you're talking about really do need that support.
So I'm kind of an outsider. I'm British. I moved here the 1st of May 2011, and the next day Stephen Harper gets his majority government. And I was staying with my supervisor at the time, and he was swearing.
Did you cause that?
I really hope not. He's made it much more difficult for me to stay, so I don't know if he's trying to tell me something. But yeah, it's so kind of like the students that MC has been teaching. I've only been in Canada under the Harper government, and I've seen all the changes that he's implemented, and I'm in this bubble here, and everyone I've met is pretty much Southern Ontario, this kind of area, and they're all in this bubble with me where no one is happy with the changes that Stephen Harper's made, the changes to the Fisheries Act, the withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol, that kind of stuff. And like the members of the public that I've talked to, my friends, family, and other people that I've met, they're pretty anti it. But I've heard people in like Alberta and stuff, the public are not quite as receptive to the science ideas behind it. And is that going to get any better? If the Harper government falls at the next election, I don't know whether that's likely, and I don't know when that is because I'm not allowed to vote in it. But is it going to get any better for government scientists for talking to the public?
Oh boy, I fear for government science. I was at a forum in Edmonton last week on public policy where they're asking the question. This is touring across the country with the Canadian academies, national academies, and there is one person there who spoke very loudly, who was Minister Kent's one staff member, and he said that the general sense was that you should get rid of all government science, period. So, and you ask about Alberta, you have to remember that the same government has been in power in Alberta for 44 years. Our government's been in power longer than the government in Iran. So there is a deep conservatism there that it's a very different mindset, and it's very close to the surface. And when I heard you say that about the Athabasca state of the, it produces a ceiling that's very low, doesn't it? Yeah. But that's why, as I said yesterday, there are critical moments when change can occur. And we're in one of those moments, and that moment will be this fall. And it's going to be very important to see, because if we have, in my view, if we continue to have the kinds of policy changes that we have seen in the last 5 years, and we do 5 more years of that, there's going to be a lot of things we won't be able to recognize. So I think these sorts of things are critical. And again, it speaks to what we're talking about here. What a tragedy it would be to have the kind of science we have, the kind of knowledge we have about northern hydroclimatic conditions, for example, and to know where we're going, and for that to hit that low ceiling and never get into the decision-making realm, man.
Oh, I was just going to add that in all these conversations I had with people in the Athabasca who are like organic farmers and environmentalists and people in tourism who feel like they're fighting this big fight and are incredibly, I had some very depressing interviews, people who were just sort of like really extremely frustrated and depressed about what's happening. And I eventually just started asking, like, well, why are you still doing this? And I ended up coming up with this big theme in my research of like, well, we have to do something and we have to hope. And so what I ended up, one of my research findings is that people don't think they're going to change anything through collaboration. They think that what they're going to do is engage enough people and talk to enough people that they will eventually be able to change the Alberta political system. But this is what they're hoping for, is not through change through collaboration, but through change, that they will get to change through engagement and then through the traditional system. Because, yeah, it's, as Bob was saying, it's sort of this, this monolith, and it's been there for so long, and it's a very, like, it's part of the way they think. In Alberta, I had government people talking about needing a social license to operate the government. And like, a government gets elected. They don't, like, you should not need a social license to operate. You have one because you were elected democratically, supposedly. And they were talking about like very corporate language. So it's this specific, Alberta I feel is a bit of a special case. But it's the same sort of pushing for this sea change in politics where you're going to be able to get to a point where you can make change. And you're not necessarily there yet.
It's something I've noticed with government TV adverts, which freak me out as slightly Orwellian, but anyway, and they're like really kind of pimping the tar sands and like, look at what we're doing here, look at all these jobs, especially from the government of Canada. And then you're like, well, that's nice, but you're not saying kind of your environmental impact and everything. And we have a new faculty member in biology joined the same time as Heidi did, Rebecca Rooney. And I went to her talk that she had to give as part of her application process, and she is remediating tar sands. And they're not, and she's like, they're taking out these peat bogs, and I'm replacing the wetlands, but they're not being replaced, they're being turned into salt wetlands, which isn't the same thing. And I feel like that with the government being so like pro this, look what we're doing, it's so amazing, and it's the message of some of the effects. It's getting out to a certain degree, but some of the aspects that are going along with it aren't reaching the general public.
Could I just make a comment on Alberta on this? This is very, very interesting, because I live in Alberta, but I travel a lot, and it's really interesting to see Alberta from an outside perspective. And one of the reasons why I think we're so entrenched in our thinking in that province is that we made a very significant commitment as a province to make the oil sands a major economic pillar. And this is interesting. Once you make that decision, you have to prove that it's right. Right? Well, and especially if you've got hundreds of billions of dollars invested in this, and that is also the revenues that you're using to make prosperity possible, you've got to defend that. And that's one of the reasons why, and it took me a long time to figure this out, why that ceiling's so low. It's because every time you bring up climate change, it is an assault on that choice to make the oil sands that major a pillar. So they can't just easily say, yeah, that's happening, because then it puts into contradiction the investment that they made. And this is a very interesting economic problem. And especially now with falling oil prices, the whole question is coming up of whether or not the province, and ergo the federal government, which reflects Alberta's interests in energy and resource extraction, have not put the country's economic ladder up against the wrong wall. So it's a very interesting and deeply entrenched defensiveness regarding this, and it has to do with wealth.
It was kind of interesting when I moved out here. I'd heard of the tar sands very briefly. I used to work for a cosmetics company called Lush, which is based in the UK, and it makes kind of sort of handmade. The whole idea is it kind of being more kind of organic and fair trade and this kind of thing. And they used to run campaigns every so often. One of the first ones they did when they first opened was against animal testing, various other environmental campaigns that they would highlight in their shops. And I remember just before I moved out here, and I went in to visit some old colleagues, and they had a tar sands campaign going down. And it was the first I'd ever heard of it. And it was very interesting to hear kind of from an environmental point of view what people were thinking about it. And then I come over here and kind of the message that I kind of got about the tar sands was very, very different. I mean, obviously I got it from a biased source of a company that was very interested in environmental causes, but equally it was very interesting to hear what people were saying about it here.
You're from the Netherlands. Can you comment about the difference perhaps between government and science from the Netherlands compared to here? Like, I realize you won't get here for a little bit, but...
Yeah, so I'm not very familiar with the political situation here yet, but from the feeling I'm just getting from this conversation, I would just wanted to add that it seems like here there's a very strong focus on a single message, whereas, I mean, from the Netherlands we like discussing things openly, and it's more acceptable to have different point of views on the table. So why can I not say like, okay, we need these oil sands because they are our economy, we need the money from them, but we also at the same time have a strategy for implementing any effects from that money, because it's a lot of money. You could use it at the same time to remediate some of the effects, basically. So that would be more of a Dutch perspective, is because, well, we made some choices in our country that were negative for the environment, but at the same time some of the money is used, or at least there is a public discussion about how to, about the consequences of those choices as well as the positive benefits. So I'm not sure if that's possible here, but
You make a really good point, you know, and the whole thing is that, first of all, I want to ask, how many of you been to the oil sands? Okay, and I would assure, if you've been there, you will agree with me, that you almost have to see it to understand it. Yeah. But the point that you make is right. I mean, the worry that I have is that we're advertising that we're doing those things and not doing them. That we are more interested in public relations and how and having people trust in and believe in and see the economic value of this. And I think that's got us off track because we keep finding out that the information we've got's wrong or it's incomplete or we haven't got the right story. So it's hard to trust what's going on up there. And when you have a media campaign that is, they spend as much on media as I'm sure they do on research, and you get really concerned about whether or not what that means. But these are interesting problems. And were you going to speak?
Yeah, I have a couple of things about that. The first is about the message. So I work in Resolute Bay, and I was trapped up there. There was bad weather with all the senior administrators of the government. It was open house at Resolute Bay. And there was a scientific talk, and I could watch the policy people at the back of the room start to get sort of worked up about it. And as soon as it was over, they said, she can stay on message. And so it's very clear that they have a specific takeaway message that they wanted the scientists to emphasize. They weren't to deviate from in any capacity. And when they did, you could sort of feel the tension around the room, which makes me a little nervous in terms of, just in terms of everything actually. But especially in terms of how the public is gonna receive that, because they're not gonna understand that it's the policy people that are driving the messages, not the scientists anymore. And I think that that's part of what I found so offensive, is the scientists should know what the key findings in their science is, not the policy people necessarily, right? And so for the policy people to tell them what they are and aren't allowed to say, it turned me off. I was going to work for government. I no longer intend to, do something else. I'm not sure what yet.
That's impactful statement.
Yeah, like it was just watching the whole process. I was like, I'll get fired. I'll just get fired. I know this. And so I need to pick a new career path, basically, is the first point. And the second point was that I work just with what I do. I tend to work in some pretty controversial, so the whole anti-vaccination thing going on right now, I come up against aquaculture quite a bit. And what we're finding is that they've just done a study in vaccination, and the more the scientists speak, the less the public believes. And so there seems to be this era of we don't believe science anymore. And so even though we're giving a message very clearly, there's this belief that, I don't know if it's access to the internet or people thinking they can do their own research and not fully understanding the findings, but the more we say this is what you need to do, medical advice tells you this is what you should be doing, the less they'll do it and the more rigid they're becoming in their opinion.
Which scientists? Government scientists or university scientists?
Any. In this case, they associate with big pharma, but we see the same thing in aquaculture. The more we can say to them, it's not necessarily aquaculture fish that are spreading disease to wild fish. There are issues there you need to look at, but it's not that simple. And the more that the government scientists speak or the university scientists speak, the more that the message is becoming entrenched and it becomes more of a political fight rather than a scientific discussion. And I wonder with the tar sands if the same thing is happening, because I know there's some very staunch anti-climate change believers, right? And with the, I don't know, I just thought it was interesting to consider whether or not what we have to say is of any relevance to the public anymore in their view.
That's a really good point. It's a huge issue. National Geographic, a couple of issues back, had a piece on this, that people don't believe science anymore. This is more than Canadian government science. I mean, this is one of the things I think we have to be concerned about. We've got the scale wrong. It's that people are suspicious of science now. About half of Americans don't believe that climate change is caused by human activities.
Why do you think that is the case? I'll tell you one of the things that I saw. Why do you think it is that scientists are less trusted now? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's part of the education of people becoming more sophisticated, unfortunately. It is that people now see that, vitamin C is good for you, and now it's not good for you. We see that as we learn more, the message, the policy that results is reversed. And so that's why people are suspicious of these things. The other thing that I think is interesting is that people react and actually change their behavior on emotional levels, not on intellectual levels. Terry O'Reilly was one of our speakers at the Canadian Water Network conference 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about exactly this. If you want to get somebody to change their behavior, you have to appeal to them on an emotional level, not an intellectual level, although it may be informed by intellect. So I think that's what we have to realize. We have to be much more sophisticated about human psychology if we're actually going to make effective change.
I find that a little bit interesting. I'm wondering if anybody found this in Canada, is that especially 2 years ago when all the ELA cuts were coming, I almost found a huge shift in public perspective to trusting scientists all of a sudden because the government didn't trust them anymore. And there's a huge campaign towards the government is shutting down their scientists and muzzling their scientists, and then all of a sudden you found a greater public support for scientists out speaking, saying, hey, we've informed these policies that have changed the public for good. And I guess that wave has kind of subsided a little bit. And I wonder if you guys felt the same way being active scientists at the time. I mean, at the time I was just doing my master's, so it was harder to get a perspective of the scientists, but your senior positions.
I want to, if I could, I know others want to speak, I just want to comment on that. And it goes back to what you said, Simon, that what we're seeing, looking at research that's coming out of the US, that the distrust in science is actually disproportionately rooted in partisanship. And that's what we found, the study, the examination. And what was really interesting about the study is that your partisan relations actually trumped your education. So you could be well educated and still not believe this because it's an ideological thing. And I think that's really interesting. You're getting at the trust in science. So and also they showed us new work about the segmentation you're talking about. And they're trying to go, and I talked about this briefly yesterday, but beyond the usual character segmentation along gender, age, education, ethnicity, etc., into deeper character traits that are based on those values, to try and find ways to get underneath that and to appeal to deeper emotional sensibilities and connections that we're going to need to appeal to if we're going to deal with the climate issue. But I'm really interested in what you said about the ELA thing, because that really did show that the government was, they were clearly, they were on the hunt for getting rid of science. And it's interesting, isn't it? Have you seen anything on that afterwards? I would like to answer your question.
Just one note on that. On that National Geographic article, the present editor of Science magazine said exactly what you just said. She said that basically we're all still in high school and we're all trying to fit in. And we're all trying to figure out which club we're in. And then we will adopt and advocate the positions of that club. And so basically, even among scientists, most of us don't actually go and look at the information on climate change. What we do is we do a sort of general poll of what those that we trust and believe. And incidentally, we all speak to each other. We never speak to other people. You wonder why we have the government we have in this country when none of us voted for it? It's because a lot of Canadians don't agree with us, actually. But we will do a poll of what most people that we respect think, and we will then think that too. And even scientists are like that.
Yeah. There's a good.
Nandita has a question.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I just say there's a good barometer of this in the press. So the press decided probably about less than a decade ago that the climate issue was done with, that they believed it. They no longer sought the dissenting, 98% of scientists agree, but Looney Prof A has this to say. They're no longer soliciting that. We've seen this in the vaccination debate. I think very clearly recently there was a piece in the Toronto Star which was so out in left field that there was a huge reaction to it. And again, people in the press have decided that that's done and they're no longer seeking the Jenny McCarthy perspective. And it circles back to people we perhaps need to try to influence. You're never going to be able to remediate for plain stupid, such as Fox News or somewhere like that, which is inherently conservative and biased, but there are all sorts of thoughtful people out there that are willing to carry a message.
So this is in relation to this question about who we believe, and we decide on that. So I find that interesting that in my work, when I'm talking to science students versus when I'm talking to civil engineers, who a lot of them are going to go get the internship in a fracking company or somewhere in the oil sands, more in the resource extraction world. So when I'm talking about engineering for sustainable development there, I see a lot of skeptics in that group, and they go out to the internet and find people they believe in, because not so much the belief comes from the fact that they're going to get that internship that pays a huge amount, and they want to believe that they are doing the right thing. So it is, even within the student community, even within the young community, there is this clear divergence about what the belief system is, and I think it's necessary to get to the ones on the other side. And it's not easy. I mean, it requires, most of my classes are talking about these kinds of issues, but it requires a lot of convincing because it's against their very grain.
I think this is something I've been thinking a lot about just because I'm working on different people working together, and also talking to a lot of people who are working in oil and who are, you sit down and talk to them and they're lovely people. Like, they're not out there trying to ruin the world, and they honestly and sincerely think that what they're doing is they're making the world better in the way that they can. And I mean, we all have a story that we live with, and like, they're like a story that we can fit ourselves into. So for a lot of them, the story is that economic growth is going to save the world, and that oil is going to help Canada to develop and grow, and this is where we need to go. And they might not think further than that, so what are the implications of that? But there's enough support for that story, people on the internet or in their communities, in their lives, that are on that same page, that you can say, like, yeah, this is what we're doing, and it's okay we're doing it, and this is these are the good things that come out of it. And it's a really valid story, and a lot of people on that side have that. And then, I mean, we have our own stories about well, we don't drink bottled water and we ride our bikes, but like, we still have cars, and we tell ourselves stories about how that's okay, even though intellectually, if we thought about it, it's not okay. And so I sort of feel, in terms of talking to the other side, it's figuring out where those stories come together so you can have those conversations. And then, but it also involves being really uncomfortable sometimes, because you're going to get into a situation where somebody says something that is just completely jarring to how you think about the world. Yeah. And the trick is having a bit of humility and being willing to sit back and listen and not discount that person immediately because they're saying something that you think is idiotic, but to sit through and just be like, okay, these are the things we agree on, and like, we don't agree on all of this, but we can have a conversation about this.
I think you're so right. We've got to be careful, because we can atomize our society on this. This is an issue that's serious enough that we'll do that. So it's really important not to demonize one another. But it's really important also, as you just said, to have those uncomfortable conversations. And avoiding them is getting us nowhere. And as I said yesterday, we all have members of our family that this is very uncomfortable stuff for them. And as I said yesterday, this has got to be what we talk about at the dinner table.
So on that note, the whole business about government science is interesting, that we feel very committed to government science. And, you know, Canada's got a proud history of some really good government science. I worked for Fisheries and Oceans for 25 years, and Canada was a world leader in fisheries and marine and freshwater science. What if it is the case that we can't actually afford two parallel systems of science, academia and government, and that we have to make a choice, because otherwise we're going to see our universities crumble, which they are. What if we have to make a choice? Which would you choose? First of all, do you buy the argument that we have to make a choice? And secondly, how much would it really matter if we got rid of government science? What can't be done in institutions within academia?
Oh boy! Drop the puck, drop the gloves, right? Yeah.
Isn't that all about funding source?
Well, who wants to start on it? You want to go, Heidi?
I'm only going to pick at the edge of that giant bomb you just dropped in the middle of the room. And to answer the last thing that you raised, what can't universities do that governments could do? I think there's this great textbook that was published in the early 2000s called Canadian Environmental Policies and Politics. And they divided science into, academic science, regulatory science, and then more activist science. science. And I think where government really has a role is that regulatory and monitoring science, because we don't have the stability in funding cycles to be able to maintain long-term data sets, or really think more on the scale. Anything beyond 3 to 5 years is extremely nebulous, whereas before the rain, you would know better than me, but it seems like there were quite a few long-term projects, such as ELA, that could be maintained. So that would be one thing that I would say that I think universities are very ill-equipped to deal with, and also because of the turnover in students. It's not actually the profs doing so much of the research, it's the students. And so if you have a weaker student coming into the middle of your 50-year data set, you could really have some problems there.
And I just want to say I massively agree with Heidi on that. Some of the data that I've been using is counting fence data from Newfoundland, which is like these decades-long time series that DFO have kept and manage, and every year they go to the rivers, they dump in the counting fences, they count the smolts, they take various samples, and then they count all the returning adults. And it's incredibly useful data, and now due to government funding cuts and various other things, they're having to scale back a number of these counting fences and destroy data sets that have lasted for so long and provide such useful information and can be used to inform so many decisions and become the jumping off point for various new projects, that it wouldn't, in academia it would be very hard to do that kind of thing, and without that kind of data then we can't make informed decisions and we can't build policy in the way that it needs to be built.
Well, that's good, but long-term funding, long-term reliable funding could be administered through university institutes, right? So, and that could get us around the problem of all the work being done by students, although they would benefit much more from the work. And so I think that's one of the things, and as you point out, there's less and less reliable funding within government, and as Alex pointed out, when you're in a government department as a scientist, what you are there to do is to support the minister. Wouldn't it be better to be instead getting back to what Bob was talking about, what public service used to be about, which is serving the public?
Okay, I've got to speak on this one, okay, because this is just too important. I really worry, Simon, and this is an important conversation to have. It's an important question to ask, because we should be asking these questions, because this is being discussed in those senior levels. And I worry about us caving in and allowing that kind of thinking to be the norm. You know, that, okay, here's what I feel. You know, we're saying here in this that we feel distanced and excluded from government. And now we want not even to have the links with peers and associates within those governments. And the second thing I see is that, you know, I worry about the role of universities. Remember, the role of the university is to produce graduates. And this continuity issue you bring up is very critical in my mind, because I've seen really critical work being done. You know the networks, we worked in them, and you know them. And then as soon as they're over, that research is gone. I mean, it's terminated. There's no more of it. And so that continuity. And also I feel that science for standards is really important. I mean, and having the foundation in government to be able to be on top of standards. And let me just give you an example. I think Alberta cut its capacity to such an extent when the flood occurred, they didn't have the depth within their own organization to do what is necessary to come up with an integrated plan to deal with that. So consequently, they had to go to consultants. And if you don't mind me saying, the consultants looked at this as just, wow, this is going to be a great big payday with lots of billable hours on this. And then we start building one big expensive mistake on top of the other, because we don't have that depth inside government. And also, I worry about this. I worry about this sort of thinking, allowing governments to back away from their own fiduciary responsibility, which is to protect the common good. And I worry seriously about that matter, because you know, it's easy for just say we won't do that, even if it is within your constitution, within the way our society is designed and what government ought to be doing in the contract with us that allows us to give them the power over us. I worry about that, Simon, I really do.
And that's, sorry, as something I've noticed as well when people are discussing government scientists, they're like, well, how can they be fair? How can they not be biased? They're getting money from the government, and then they clearly have to stay on the government point. And while the Harper government is
But not all governments have ever been making saving the minister the principal role of the government.
Exactly, and
right?
this is something that really bugs me. It's like, well, how can they be fair? And I'm like, well, how can any scientist be fair if you're going to just judge them on where their money is coming from? There are plenty of scientists who are really mad that they're being muzzled, and they're yelling this to the media. Various scientists are saying, I'm being muzzled, I can't do this, I can't do that. Scientists, while not all of them have, there is the idea of having respect for your science, respect for what you're doing, and publishing your results regardless. I might be sounding incredibly naive and at the start of my career and whatever, but the idea that you publish the data that you get, and it may not be on point for whoever your funding source is, and there are plenty of people in academia who get money from the tar sands or from this dam operator or this person to get money to run projects, and they may not get the results their employer wants. They may not get, oh, if you put a dam in here, I'm sorry, but it's going to destroy this entire ecosystem, you really shouldn't do that. They're not going to go to their employer and say, well, we found this data and we're going to give it to you, but just ignore it. They're going to go to their employer and say, we have this data, we've given you this data. What the employer or the government then does with it is their business, and maybe it should be something they should be held accountable to, but the scientist isn't going to change their answer depending on what their funding source is. Everyone is always going to have biases depending on their funding source, and it's not just going to be a government funding source. Wherever you get your money from, there's always going to be a bias. So to just say that government scientists are the only ones with biases is wrong, and it bugs me.
I also think there's something to say about the tedium that goes into government science. I mean, this coming from, right now facing the fact that we've collected thousands of samples from the Beaufort Sea that have to be archived and frozen and labeled, and the data made into data reports, and that's going to take years, and trying to get a grad student to do that, I think that there's a lot of tedium that the government covers that's for really important future archiving of science that could be used in policy and things like that, that is stored in other forms other than just the scientific articles that are the major form of disseminating science in universities.
That's a very, very powerful point, and there's an interesting archive of tissue. So these were gull eggs from Lake Ontario, and because they were there, scientists at the National Water Research Institute were able to go back and determine that concentrations of a substance, PBDEs, flame retardants, had risen exponentially over time, from a time when we didn't even know about PBDEs being important in the environment, let alone in the milk of Inuit women. So those archives are tremendously, tremendously important. And you're right, it takes a lot of money to archive those things, and funding for them is sometimes very tough to find. For example, DFO had a fish tissue archive that they basically was willing to walk away from it. Eventually Environment Canada picked it up in some sort of complex negotiation, but this is left to individual departments and bureaucrats to say, well, we're no longer funding that, is, I think, potentially wrong, and we should be taking an overarching view of some of these things.
Just a quick comment to follow up. So Bob, you made the point that this is an important conversation to have about how we fund science in Canada and how we go ahead and do things. My question there is, where should this be happening? Is it the Canadian Council of Academies? Where should this conversation be held? Is it the Royal Society?
Well, certainly the Canadian Council, Canadian Academies is part of this policy thing. They were visiting 5 or 6 cities across Canada to ask some of these questions. But the problem is that it's only being held within the PMO, if you know what I mean. It's not being widely discussed. And I think, again, this could be, I worry about that because this could be included in further omnibus bills and just catch us by surprise. So we should be having this conversation and be deciding on the conditions that we're talking about here, what we think about this. Because it could happen. It's being discussed, like you say.
I agree. I think we should have this conversation. I think we should be proposing the forum in which that conversation is held.
I'm with you.
So I just wanted to add sort of the opposite perspective. There's currently a large public discussion going on in the Netherlands about the role of university research and academic research and how much academics should be allowed or encouraged to pursue their own interests, which may not be directly relevant to society but could result in new discoveries in 20 or 50 years or something. Or should scientists be much more focused on what the public is actually interested in and have more. So basically the public in the Netherlands kind of wants to have more influence on what academia is researching, what topics are of, they want more topics that are of direct interest to them. So this is kind of the other question, if you move government science away to universities, does that still allow universities to also, academics at university also pursue their own interests, which may not have a clear direct relevance, but could really have important effects over longer terms that are not directly visible to policymakers and public. So can we still have both of these roles if there is only university?
And the questions, these questions are linked.
Yes.
I was just going to say that for my project, I have 2 academics on my committee and 2 government scientists on my committee, and so what I do would never be possible without either one of those. So there's basically a synergistic relationship between academia and the government, and I think that if we ignore that kind of value that working together adds, or that having both of those groups of scientists working together adds, then we really lose a lot.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, I think we should take up Simon's point a little further. Who can do this? Can it be an organisation like CWM whose long-term future is perhaps somewhat in the air in terms of
it's open to opportunity,
long-term sustainability and open to opportunity? So can it be a conservation organisation that's been there for a long time, pollution probe? Should it be some sort of conglomerate of universities?
And the second question that should be answered is who's going to be asked? Like this panel I was at in Edmonton was really interesting. It was Alberta for sure, you know, and the general sense is that get rid of it all. You know, so who gets asked is really important too. I mean, is it business leaders? There were academics there, but mostly from applied sciences. And this is an interesting problem. It goes back to your point. You know, when we produce graduates, especially with advanced degrees, is the only place for them to go to work in the private sector then? You know, or are we going to have? Is there going to be adequate university research on an ongoing basis if we get rid of government science? A lot of questions need to be answered on this.
Yeah, and I think if everybody comes to the table, you know, with no sacred cows, I was very committed, still am, to government science. I love being a DFO scientist. I was very proud to be a DFO scientist. And perhaps it's just because I didn't work on files that mattered all that much, but I never felt I was muzzled. The sorts of things that I did, you know, I could talk freely about.
Nobody asked your opinion.
Oh, shut up.
Well, but is that relevant?
Incoming.
Yeah. So, and like I will come back to that. Like your degree, I did my PhD work co-supervised by somebody in government science and in academia, and I found that very powerful. But my point isn't that. My point is not that we reduced that we should reduce the commitment nationally to research. And I'm very sensitive to your point about the pure versus applied, the long benefits versus the short benefits. But my suggestion is that we need to think a little bit more broadly, that there are other ways that we can meet what government science is doing, perhaps through institutes at universities, which would still allow that some of the tedious data that need to be collected, long-term, counting fences and things, we could manage those sorts of things. Large infrastructure, the ships that DFO manages, for example, to do the Arctic research that is so important. We could manage those things and get greater benefit to universities from them, maybe by some other kind of arrangement.
I have to say there's something similar to that in the UK, where I did my master's at the University of Southampton. One of the departments there is the School of Ocean and Earth Sciences. It's located in the Southampton docks out in the Southampton water, and the building is a shared building. Its half is SOAS, so the school, and the other half is a government funding agency, which is our equivalent of NSERC, which is NERC. And the school owns and operates a number of research vessels, some of them jointly with government and some not. One of the largest one being the RSS James Cook, which is this enormous big ship that every year will do a big transect of the Atlantic down to the Antarctic. And it works, and those ships in confluence with both government and so the NSERC with government scientists and with scientists from the school do a lot of good work, and there is some work between them which uses both funding sources.
There's a very interesting comment made by Jay Ingram a couple of years ago at the meeting that I was at in Banff, and he talked about his fear that government science used to be science for the public good, and it's now become science in support of the government agenda. And I think that's become true. But it's important to unpack that a little bit, because government science and the actions of civil servants are supposed to be in support of the government of the day. And the government of the day has decreed, maybe not decreed, has made it so that government science is less important and less visible, and tolerating whatever science is being left and using it when it suits them. But that's the government that was elected. So government scientists are in the conundrum that they signed on knowing that they were to provide the advice within the strictures of the of the system, and by and large, I think the overwhelming proportion of scientists who work for government accept that and do their job and provide their input, which goes into senior levels and is then considered, or less or more. But ultimately, everyone who's signed up as a government scientist signs up that they're working under a series of strictures. And the young lady there who said that she'd reconsidered her choice and wouldn't want to work for government because of those strictures, I respect that decision. But certainly when Simon and I were in our respective departments, we supported the government of the day. And the government of the day can change its opinion about what its priorities are. We may not like it, but they're the ones who are elected. Now, it's far more interesting in Europe, where you're now living a lot of coalition governments, and a lot of people have to accommodate, as opposed to being directed by some regime. It's very worrying what's happened.
That feels like a very honest statement. That statement there to me is saying it like it is. It's no longer saying, "Oh, we're being muzzled" or whatever. There is some agreement within government work that you must serve the government of the day.
Yes.
And that to me is just a reality that we need to accept, and then make decisions based on that. Do we want a different look at who we're serving? okay, but that's, at least we know where the buck stops.
Well, can you shift it back so that the scientists are serving the public, or is it just an innate part of government structure that they have to answer to the government every day?
I saw something on the CBC website, and I only read through it briefly, so I can't quite remember the details, but there was a survey done of what the Canadian public wanted to see the government focusing on in terms of science and research, and then compare it to the goals that the Canadian government wanted. And there was this big disconnect between what the Canadian government, the people who purport to represent Canadians' views, thought that Canadian people wanted, i.e. more business, more kind of R&D, that kind of stuff, when a large proportion of the Canadian people were more interested in kind of science, in like the environment and that aspect.
But should have voted that way.
Yeah, but isn't that a reflection of our voting system more than anything else? Like, he had a 30% approval in the election and won a majority, right?
I don't get, how does your
We just vote split between our two.
is it first past the post like in the UK?
Yes, exactly the same. Yeah.
Oh, joy. Yeah, because
Because in a sense, our scientists are serving the public, the 30% public that elected a conservative government. So it's that story, I think, that may be more important to tell, is that, okay, yeah, our scientists are serving our public, our majority representation.
You know, this is a very interesting conversation, and it really causes me to agree with you. I think we've got to get on top of this question, because if the government is reelected this fall, and if they have a majority, we might just have a choice imposed on us, and we ought to have had the conversation before it happens, at least, so that we can perhaps inform public opinion and let the government know where and it might be very divisive to this community to have this dialogue.
Well, it will be. I had this conversation with David Schindler, and I said, where is this conversation happening about how...
What did he say?
He said it's not. He said it's not being talked about in the Royal Society. He said that there is no forum in which this is being talked about. Somebody needs to pick this up and run with it.
And you're a new chair, probably can't, because you have to be apolitical.
Oh, I didn't sign that agreement.
You're a UN staffer.
I got a question for the graduate students here. We see this, we're at odds at our upper echelon of science in Canada. How does that make you feel? Like, where's your place? Where's your voice? Do you feel like you have a trajectory right now where you will be heard?
in terms of my career path?
In terms of your career path, in terms of the capacity for whatever research you do to actually impact policy?
I'm really fortunate in that I'm directly involved with the Fisheries and Oceans Project. So that, for me, but I feel very fortunate in having come into a project that has that. And it was actually a huge draw for why I entered the PhD program to begin with, was because I felt like there could be, and I recognize that just doing the work and handing it over is not enough to make it be heard or make it be applicable to a policymaker. But there is a lot to learn in dealing with the people who do deal with that from day to day. And you can see when you're in a meeting full of mostly government scientists and technicians and administrators to that degree, what they're saying and how they're changing their conversation to change from what I'm interested in, predator-prey mass ratios and trophic transfer efficiency with depth. And they're like, so what does that mean for someone who wants to drill at 500 meters versus 1,000 meters? And you're like, oh, okay, so I have to change the story I'm telling. And I think that there's a lot to learn about just how to speak to be heard.
Bingo. Well done. Very well articulated.
I think we're also quite fortunate in that the Arctic group of government scientists have more funding because Harper, the Arctic is a priority. Mm-hmm. And so we have a very skilled, very, very good, very cohesive group of government scientists that we get to work with at DFO. And I think that Jim in particular does a very good job of shepherding all of us through that process. Yeah. He's just a career scientist and he's excellent. And so we maybe have a slightly better trajectory that way than other people might.
Compared to the department of DFO that I work most closely with, so the salmonids, department at St John's, where one of my committee members is located, and they don't have the same level of funding. They've lost a couple of very important research techs that went out every year and did all the counting fence stuff, did all the scale readings and stuff that are associated with the long-term data sets, and for them, it's not going so well.
Yeah, from my experience, I worked with industry as well as DFO, so my research priorities are set by DFO, but then industry is who funds my research. So it becomes this interplay between creating valuable information for the mind to use, and then again, it's the same sort of thing. Do we want to use it or not? It's how does this play into the story we're telling? So I guess back to the original question that I asked, is it can be quite frustrating, and I think there's a lot at stake for our scientific elders to come up with something that's cohesive, because I think we have a lot of young minds that maybe don't know what the future looks like in science, and that's frustrating. It's frustrating to be going to school, learning a lot and spending a lot of hours and sweat on increasing our knowledge base, and then not knowing where we're going to end up.
You know, it's too bad Kelly McKittrick isn't here, somebody that many of us work closely with, and I think Bob would agree with this. Kelly would say there are no problems, there's only opportunities. Yeah. And I think what Bob said earlier is absolutely right. We're at a watershed moment in how we do things, and that's just amazingly exciting. There's the opportunity to do something bigger and better. There's the opportunity to feed into the way things are going to go forward. That's what I'm trying to get across. Not that we need to sack government science or anything like that, but rather that we don't have to go on with what was before. There is the opportunity now to rethink it and to do something really exciting.
And Carl, you don't need your scientific elders telling you what to do. Let me just relate to a very interesting thing. I was sitting in my government office at CCIW, NWRI, National Water Research Institute, and get a call from this guy called Mehrdad Hariri. Never heard of him. He says, I'm interested in getting together a science conference on science policy. Yeah, okay, that's great. Didn't really pay all that much attention. He popped up again, came to see me, and thought, yeah, okay, this sounds really quite good, but thought, not a chance in hell he's going to be able to organise this. He's now organised 6 major conferences on all the Canadian Science Policy Conference. It's a struggle to raise the funds each year, but each year it's grown to about 500 people. It's become the forum. And he was I think, a doctoral student at the time, along with 2 or 3 others who said, this needs to happen at the University of Toronto. And he has this national organisation. He went and saw people like Preston Manning to get their endorsement. He had all sorts of senior people. The minister has appeared at every conference. So you can certainly seek some ideas, but you are the next generation of leaders, quite frankly. And it takes somebody with some guts and vision to say, this is what we should do, and think big.
Yeah,
I just want to comment. I understand what Kelly's trying to say with that sort of thing, but I almost have to protest in a sense about this. There's no problems, only opportunities. I worry about happy talk. I really worry about how much happy talk there is. And I think that sort of thing goes, well, oh, yeah, it's all good. And I'm worried about some of the things that were brought up in terms of hope. And, the problem that I see is that, yeah, okay, there are problems and there is progress, but our progress is being mocked and overshadowed by population growth, expansion of our economies, and the damage that we're doing. And we've got to start seeing that. So I think it's important to have the hard conversations. We've got to stop preventing ourselves from having those and avoiding them. I'm not satisfied that we can look at this simply as an opportunity thing, because that suggests that there's a continuum that we're going to just carry on the business as usual, and our innovation and business are going to solve these problems. I have no evidence that suggests that we're getting anywhere but in very much deeper trouble. That's what concerns me about that.
Well, Bob, I think as Alex said earlier, we're in violent agreement. My attitude is that people are extraordinary at innovation at the very last moment. Just before you hit the wall, that's when people are great. And what is exciting is that's where we are right now. We're just about to hit the wall. And I think there is a growing, your talk was very good evidence of this, that there is a growing recognition that we've come to the end of our dither period. There is dithering no more. Now it's all about what are you going to do? And that's the opportunity, and that's what I'm trying to get across, that that's the opportunity, that's what's exciting. Things are going to happen in the next 5 years, not sometime.
I hope you're right.
We have about 10 minutes left, so we can either conclude or we can keep going. It depends on what people want to do.
We can also have, once you continue this discussion,
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
we have to leave
absolutely.
here.
Where are the washrooms?
Outside of around a corner.
Yeah, are we going to terminate now then, or?
Well,
Okay.
let's.
'Cause
the thing is, once we terminate here, the documentation is over as well, right? So this is going to be a resource. So if you want to keep talking, we have.
Well, I just like when we're ready to quit, I'd just like to make a couple of observations if I could.
Does anybody else have something they'd like to say?
Can we eat and chat, or is that going to be too disruptive to the video?
It's the audio will be. How loud is it too?
But perhaps it's best if we conclude.
Well, hold on. Does anybody have anything they'd like to say? You good? So we'll just move to closing remarks.
Okay, well, again, I just want to thank you for the invitation to come here. This has been a really interesting conversation, and what it's demonstrated to me is, again, we have outstanding people rising in this system, and I believe in this. I really have strong confidence in your generation to rise to these very difficult problems. And I think it's really important we had this discussion about the role of science, because we're emerging into a very turbulent scientific milieu, and I think it's going to be really important that there are people in the midst of what is going to be clearly a very turbulent and divisive period who can keep their heads, stay calm, and rely on good science. And I think we need to see ourselves playing that role. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, I think, Simon, you're quite right. I think one of the things that's going to happen is, as part of this, is we're going to question the very role of the kind of science that's being done and for what purpose. Now, you touched on it. You certainly touched on it, and I think it doesn't hurt us to have that discussion, but I think we have to have it, not have the results of it imposed on us. So I think that's an added thing that you're going to have to be examining beyond your own research and research outcomes, and also the huge challenge of translating your research outcomes into language that the average person can understand, that the decision makers can use to craft timely and durable policy. So for me, this has been a very rich dialogue, and again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.